Hi everybody who's here and everybody who's not here. I appreciate you guys being here. Those of you that couldn't, I understand. It happens. Yeah, cool. And you guys all saw my email, right? The three of you? Okay, cool. Cool. I didn't want to like force you guys to be here. You really have something pressing to do. Yeah. Yeah, sorry that I didn't dress up for you today. This is what I would normally wear. I'm limping to the finish line just like everybody else. So, anyways, cool. Let's do the listening quiz. For those of you playing along at home, this is what you get. I trust all of you to not cheat. It'd be super dumb if you did, but I like all of you, so I don't think you will. So here we go. Here is first part number 1 for the listening quiz. I'm going to drop the needle on this one. Come back to those if necessary. Here's number 2. other listening examples at the end. For those of you at home, you can rewind the video. You're not okay. So part 2, I will play all of these recordings are of Miles Davis led ensembles, or have Miles Davis in the ensemble. They might not necessarily be Miles's leader, but they are from one of the 4 kind of phases we talked about so far in class. So when he's playing with Charlie Parker, when he has this cool jazz kind of thing going on, doing the first great quintet, or from the record specifically Kind of Blue. Take a educated guess as to what it is, or if you've checked out the records, you'll know what it is anyway. And then give me some characteristic of the music that you hear that helps place it firmly in that time period. So here is the second part, number 1. I spoke loud enough that you guys could all hear me. And does anyone like to hear anything again?
The first one on part 1.
First one on part 1. Here it is. Anything else? Going once, going twice. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Sweet, I will take your quizzes. Go ahead. Thank you. Thank you. Sweet. And as a reminder to those of you not here, those are due by midnight tomorrow. Otherwise, it's a 0. That's the only way it can be fair. Cool. Give me a second while I pull up the lecture, and don't pull up my playlist, because that would be bad. Okay. So, today... Oh, I see. Okay, hold on. Because I'm filming this, I have to, also shut this off. I think I have to pull up my playlist on here first. Sweet, okay. Cool. Get this arranged. Okay. Bless you. Okay, cool. So today I want to talk a little bit more about the year 1959, kind of wrap that up. I also want to make sure we don't gloss over Bill Evans, who we've mentioned a couple times as the piano player for Miles Davis. But he's another guy that kind of could deserve a course of his own. Bill Evans was a piano player born on August 16th, 1929 in Plainfield, New Jersey. And in a recent poll of jazz pianists, he was kind of considered the second most influential pianist of all time behind only Art Tatum. And in fact, in that same survey, on the people specified jazz pianists, Bill Evans goes to number 1. So his influence cannot be understated. And his approach to the piano takes into account, the influence of Art Tatum and Teddy Wilson and some of the great swing pianists we've heard so far, but it also is deeply influenced, as I've mentioned several times now, by Impressionism, perhaps more so than any other piano player. And it's deeply introspective and introverted. We've heard Art Tatum do the whole extroverted thing, and we've heard piano players like Bud Powell just blazing through things. Bill Evans has those kind of chops, but he mostly chooses not to use them. He mostly chooses to be very melodic, very tender with his improvisations, and his solo piano work is some of the most interesting of the jazz repertoire. As I mentioned, he's very influenced by the French composers and the Impressionists. And his trio is well worth mentioning as well. It's one of the greatest piano trios of all time. It was Bill Evans on the piano, Scott LaFaro on the bass, who we're about to listen to a recording where he died in a car accident just days after this recording was made, in his early 20s. And then Paul Motion on the drums, who becomes important later. And this trio is important because they have a different approach to trio playing that we've seen so far. For the most part, our trios have been pretty straight ahead with the instruments having defined roles. The bass is walking, the drums is just swinging, piano will be playing a melody, or some horn will be playing a melody with piano comps. But this trio takes a much more, and maybe even Bach-influenced approach, where it's very interactive. Sometimes the bass will play the melody while the piano accompanies it. Sometimes the drums even plays the melody. And when Bill Evans is playing the melody, Scott LaFaro is not necessarily walking bass lines, but he's adding counter lines and little improvisatory lines, little solo-like lead lines too as well, instead of necessarily just walking all the time. And Paul Motion marks the time in a very strong way, but it's not necessarily just the thing we've gotten used to. He's doing interactive, rhythmic things as well, and he plays very melodically on the drums. We're going to listen to a tune called Glorious Step from the record Sunday at the Village Vanguard. Like as mentioned, recorded right near the end of Scott LaFaro's life, and obviously very close to the end of this trio's time together. They're highly influential and have an impact on how jazz is kind of played moving forward. We moved from a place where jazz is someone has timekeepers and everybody has steady roles, to more of an interactive, free-flowing thing where there's not necessarily one person responsible for playing time or for playing solo lines, but it's kind of a collective thing that is more of a group interplay type thing than necessarily a strict in time, in tempo type thing. So this is Glorious Step. Be listening especially to the bass and the way that it interacts with the melody. Maybe? Hello? Oh, got it. I have to switch to airplane now. Another record that you should check out in its entirety. I have a tradition of whenever I'm going somewhere on Sunday mornings, I always listen to Sunday at the Village Vanguard when I'm driving somewhere in my car. It's just a great Sunday morning type record. A couple things to point out. So during the head, as I kind of mentioned, the drums aren't necessarily playing steady time. They're interacting with the head and they're playing rhythmic things that are in time and suggest the time, but they're not necessarily strictly responsible for creating time. The trio as a whole is responsible for creating the groove and the time. And Paul Motian is able to interact with the melody and do things, and listen to when he's playing and when he's not playing. There are times when he's not playing at all, which for jazz up to this point, it's pretty rare to hear a drummer just stop playing in the middle of a section. Check this out. There he stops playing for a full measure at a time, and he's playing along with the melody. He's playing with the bass. There's one spot where the bass is waiting, and then he comes back in. And in fact, let's do this. So we're going to listen to it a couple times in a row now. This first time, just this first 30 seconds, I want you to listen to just the piano and the bass. Or excuse me, the drums and the bass. Ignore the piano for a second and just listen to what the bass and the drums are doing and how they're interacting. And keep in mind that this is an improvised arrangement. spots in there where they're connecting and they're hooking up rhythmically and they're accenting rhythms together. This time, listen to the piano and the bass, ignore the drums. So you hear the interplay in those parts. Now this time, listen to the piano and the drums together. Breaking it down and listening it that way kind of shows the tiny little interactions between the different instruments. So sometimes the drums and the piano will hook up and play something together. Sometimes the drums and the bass are playing something together. But this trio is really involved in listening to one another and really reacting to what's going on around them instead of thinking what they're going to play. So compare the feel of this music. We'll play the beginning of this one more time. I want to compare it to another thing we've heard a bunch. That style to this, which we've listened to before, especially how the rhythm section is playing.
Glad to tell you what it is later.
So here the bass is a very defined role. The drums are doing their thing. Piano player is comping, not playing melodies, not interjecting, anything like that. So the Bill Evans Trio is really getting into some territory that's kind of a little bit uncharted. It's not necessarily better or worse, because this music, If I Were a Bell, is all about swinging and good time and groove. And the Bill Evans thing is more like kind of a freeform thing. The comparison I always like to make is that when the Bill Evans Trio is playing together, it's almost like they've been handed a figured bass on some sort of tune, like a melody and like some chord changes, and then they're improvising an invention together that way. That's kind of how I like to think of it. So each instrument is not necessarily more important than the other. They're all interacting and responding to each other and coming up with things that way. The other thing about Bill Evans that's really notable, in addition to his playing, is his composition. I want to play for you my favorite Bill Evans tune. This is called Turn Out the Stars. It's a 40-bar piece that's broken up into 8-bar sections, none of which repeat. There's melodic material that's recycled between the sections, but it's all kind of a through-composed, almost type song. It's a beautiful piece. I'll play the melody for you. This is Turn Out the Stars with Bill Evans. stars. I particularly recommend the one by Kurt Rosenwinkel if you get a chance to check that out. Turn on the Stars by Kurt Rosenwinkel. But Bill Evans, of course, is a jazz musician. He experiments with drugs, which is where I was going with the jazz musician comment. And he dies September 15th, 1980, most likely from an overdose. But before that, he records in a number of kind of innovative settings as well. He records with his trio. He records with quintets and sextets. He records duets with guitar players like Jim Hall and with his bass players. And he also records a duo album with himself, where he records himself playing and then records again and overdubs another piano track on top of it to a really, really crazy, wild effect. So he's very, very innovative in terms of recording settings and ensemble choices as well. Any questions on Bill Evans? You could do an entire composition class about Bill Evans too. And undeniably one of the most important piano players in jazz history, really. Certainly, I think it's safe to say there's probably not been anyone more influential since his death. Maybe Herbie Hancock, but I think Herbie had a lot of Bill in many ways. Cool. So we haven't talked a lot about things that are going on in America, kind of as of late. Last we kind of left them. We were still kind of in the 30s doing the whole segregation thing. Things are relatively chill. We got World War II happens, but we haven't really checked on America in a while. And America is not doing super well right now. Once we get to about 1955 to 1963, we really see some of the protests and the word freedom becoming a very politically charged word as we get into the civil rights movement. So the term freedom kind of becomes a calling card and a politically charged word, and it means different things based on who you ask. If you ask the white population about freedom, they're going to say that America's doing great and freedom is great. If you ask the black population, they will wholeheartedly disagree with you. This is where the ruling of separate but equal facilities is kind of still at play, and this is where people are beginning to realize that separate but equal is not even a possible reality. There is no such thing as separate but equal because by creating a difference, there's an inherent hierarchy. So in I should get this right. Yeah, in the mid-50s, the Brown versus Board of Education cases make it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that school segregation is bad. And there's that famous story of the U.S. military getting involved in Arkansas the first time African-American students show up to a white school. Very famous case. And Brown versus the Board of Education did not turn out to be necessarily the solution that they thought it was going to be. It didn't end centuries of racism and segregation like they thought it would. It really just pointed out a lot of, inherent differences and difficulties in society and inequalities. And so freedom gets attached to a lot of different types of movements. Probably the most famously, the Freedom Riders in the early 60s with the bus boycotts in the South. Use it a lot, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. uses freedom a lot in his speeches to kind of, as a politically charged word, to point out the difference between legal freedom and actual freedom. And so there's another kind of area of society that begins using the word freedom or free as well, and that is jazz. This is kind of the idea of where free jazz begins to come from. And free jazz today kind of has a connotation to it that is largely negative. It's largely used to describe music that is inaccessible, not coherent, not well structured, and just random noises. But the truth could not be more different. And in fact, jazz has kind of fallen on the umbrella of free jazz as a whole. I think when a lot of people hear the word jazz, they think no rules, just completely improvised, just random noises and wrong notes. But as we've seen in this course so far, that's not the case at all. Extreme harmonic sophistication, melodic sophistication throughout. And free jazz has that same sophistication, but is seeking to liberate itself from kind of archaic rules and regulations, kind of in a parallel to society. While society and African American society is trying to free itself from old rules and the Jim Crow laws and all these unfair policies and laws and kind of institutional infrastructures that are preventing them from having freedom, so jazz music is also kind of doing that. And the free jazz pioneers saw their music as inherently political. They saw themselves faced with a choice between conforming to the old schools of thought and the old ways of doing things, and trying to achieve ultimate freedom from the bounds of harmony and rhythm and form, and to some extent even melody. It was kind of almost an anarchist thing in a way. It was very similar to the Second Viennese School, where Schoenberg completely rejected the old ways of doing things in the name of coming up with a totally radical and free new way to improvise. Cool. Yeah, and I think another important thing to point out here is that all the music we've discussed so far, and all music in general, must exist in the culture in which it is created. It's impossible to separate music from its culture, and I think that's true throughout history. Even back to Bach's era, when music was primarily seen as a vehicle for the church and as something that stayed strictly in the church. We see that in the classical era with kind of the idea of patronage and very high classical art music, and kind of the Enlightenment era. We see it in the Romantic era too, where people are coming to grips with speeding up of society, various wars, things like that. The kind of the discovery of the self and the emphasis of the self. And in classical composition also, in the early 20th century, when we see composers reacting to the world wars, particularly after 1945, when music kind of explodes in a million different directions. And I think jazz was no different. This music is tumultuous, it can be inaccessible, but it's still garnered by an underlying sense of organization, of melody, of rhythm, that makes it coherent in its own kind of way. So we're going to talk about free jazz, and we're specifically going to talk about one of the more colorful characters in American music history, and that is Ornette Coleman. Undeniably extremely influential saxophone player and composer who was one of the first to really say, this free jazz thing, we can make this work, and he really stuck with it too through a lot of trials and tribulations. We don't know the exact date of his birth. We know it is either March 9th or 19th, 1930 in Fort Worth, Texas. Coleman's father was kind of a jack of all trades. He was a cook and a mechanic, a construction worker, and really took any sort of job he could, to make ends meet. And his mother was a clerk in a funeral home, and she also worked on the side selling Avon-style beauty products. So not necessarily super lucrative careers, especially not in Texas at the time, but they did whatever they could to make ends meet. And Coleman, as he was growing up, was surrounded obviously by the blues, the Texas blues, of course, the same kind of music that influenced Charlie Christian, but he also heard church music and big band recordings. There's a lot of gospel elements in Ornette Coleman's playing and compositions. And the blues is there too, but he cites his primary influences as kind of the black churches of the South. You would have heard a lot of spirituals and African American hymns and gospel music in Texas at the time. Because Coleman was very interested in kind of free improvisations and limited by his theoretical knowledge in his early days, he endured a lot of ridicule. When he first learned how to play the saxophone, he was confused about the difference between the musical alphabet and the actual alphabet. So when he first learned his C scale, he thought that it was started on A and went up through the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, as that was. So right off the bat, he kind of learned that way and never really, well, it's not fair to say he never recovered, but he was at a disadvantage right off the bat because that's how he learned. He was made fun of in his church band because he was so bad. He took various lessons, including one with notable player Walker Foots Thomas, and instead of getting help for an entire hour, Thomas just had him look in the mirror and try to stop making funny faces while he played. He was kicked out of his high school marching band because he refused to play in the march style and was more interested in swinging. And there's even a story early in his career where he plays music at a club that is so provocative during a jam session that he's thrown out into an alley and beaten up, and his saxophone is thrown into the street. And for some reason, he continues to soldier on with the path that he was. One of my favorite quotes about Ornette Coleman is, he could play the blues, but he just didn't want to. Ornette Coleman had a very, very clear mental image and mental sound in his head of what he wanted to create, and he did it his own way. So much so that throughout his career, he played on a plastic alto saxophone. He didn't have the normal brass one like we kind of are used to. So Ornette Coleman kind of gets his first big break with an audition for Contemporary Records. Someone says, hey, this Ornette Coleman guy really has something going on, you should listen to him. And so he goes in, and the way that auditions used to work in that day, you didn't send in tapes or you didn't get a record deal right away. You actually went into the office of the bigwig, and you sat there, and there'd be a piano in his office, and he said, play me some of your tunes. So that's what Ornette Coleman did, but he didn't know how to play piano. So he struggles and kind of trips through a couple tunes on piano, and then he pulls out his plastic alto saxophone, to this super powerful music industry guy. He plays a couple tunes, and somehow this record executive is so impressed that he gives him a trial recording date, which is not cheap for the record companies at all. And so, what's this? Okay, cool. In 1959, he begins rehearsals. Actually, 1958, late 1958, he begins rehearsals for a record called The Shape of Jazz to Come. And they rehearsed this record for about 6 months, and his bandmates would say that they'd have 2 or 3 rehearsals a week, and every single time they came in, Ornette would almost invariably change everything they'd done in the last rehearsal. And so even on the record date, Ornette showed up with things they hadn't rehearsed, new things. So it's a very, very freeing type of not determinate music. I'm going to play for you a track from this record, The Shape of Jazz to Come, called Lonely Woman. This is just a wild track. This is the first track. Yeah, just take a listen to how it's different than anything we've listened to so far. And yeah, we'll talk about it. It's pretty out there. Okay, so obviously that recording is very, very different than anything we've heard so far. There's no piano player, first off, so it's a chordless quartet. There's trumpet, there's bass, there's alto saxophone, there's drums. There's obviously some sort of melody that the saxophone and the trumpet are playing together, but it's unclear if they're necessarily playing in time with the bass player and the drummer. They're kind of doing their own thing, and the melody is moving on at its own pace. The bass player doesn't really have any instruction at all. When you handed the lead sheet for this, it's literally just that melody line, not necessarily any set rhythm. It's just kind of determined based on how you want to perform it and phrase lengths and things like that. But it's free in a way that isn't necessarily, we haven't seen before. Whereas before, a lot of people are hemmed in from phrasing, from chord changes, from the form of the tune itself, from things like that. This is completely free. It's completely in the moment. There's little melodic fragments that pop up here and there, but ultimately the improviser and the rest of the band has the choice to do whatever they want, whenever they want, and try to come up with something cohesive just on an accident almost. Well, accident's the wrong word. They all know what they're doing musically, but through listening and coming up with things together is kind of how they're meant to do it. Ornette kind of has this thing going on throughout his whole career, and there are people that set down this specific path. But as we'll talk about next time, Miles hears this happening. He originally cannot stand Ornette Coleman, but then hears this happening and kind of finds a way to incorporate this into his own music without necessarily going as free as possible. He's still doing things with set harmony and form and rhythm, but he finds a way to kind of incorporate this free style playing into his own thing. Ornette Coleman also does a record called Free Jazz that is 2 jazz quartets, so bass, drums, piano. Is there piano on that record? I don't think there's piano on that record. Bass, drums, alto saxophone, and trumpet. 2 separate quartets that record independently, but can kind of hear what the other's doing with a tempo kind of together in mind. They're both playing free together, and then he sticks them together into one recording. If you see in Parks and Rec, there's that part, and that's the episode where I think it's called Our Listeners Love Jazz, and it's like jazz on jazz, and it's like called Jazz on Jazz, where they play a Miles Davis recording and like a Benny Goodman recording at the same time. It's not too dissimilar from what this recording Free Jazz is. So Ornette Coleman is totally radical, eventually kind of catches on with kind of an avant-garde style audience. Mostly I think these people are so fascinated, like what is this? We've never heard anything like this before. So I think that's where we'll stop for today. Thank you guys all for checking out this lecture online or in person, wherever you are. If you're going anywhere, I hope that you have safe travels. I will see you on the other side of break. Try to take some time for yourself over the break. It's important to do. Cool. I will see you all a week from today.